So hello everyone, welcome to the fourth webinar in our series about the value and impact of humane education. I'm Sabrina and I'm the director of Join Hands. We're hosting these webinars as part of our Caring for Life CFL education program, which will be launched in 50 primary schools in Sindh next year and will continue to grow over the course of this 3-year pilot. For those who don't know, CFL is all about the recognition of sentience amongst all living beings, and it teaches children to treat people, animals, and the environment with respect and compassion. The program aligns with the UN's 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and it's based on UNESCO's 4 pillars of education. For those of you who are not aware, those 4 pillars are learning to know, learning to do, learning to live together, and learning to be. While mainstream curriculum focuses a great deal on the first 2 pillars of knowing and doing, humane education actually takes that to the next level of learning how to use that knowledge and apply it in life in a pro-social and respectful way. The delivery of CFL is based on inquiry-led learning, which encourages student engagement and participation. It's meant to foster curiosity and critical thinking skills, and these teaching methods will be shared with the SEF, Sindh Education Foundation, school teachers throughout Sindh. And it is these SEF master trainers who will be training the educators in CFL content and teaching methods. And it is those master trainers who these webinars have been designed for. So let's please welcome them to the screen. Hello, everybody. So we were meant to have 2 presentations today. However, unfortunately, our first presenter was unable to make it at the very last minute because there was a COVID situation at her children's school and they all had to be home and she had to manage that. So it was a very unexpected thing. So what we've aimed to do is to still provide you with a brief introduction to her organization and the work that her organization does. But unfortunately, we won't have the opportunity to get fully into her content on resilience and respect or be able to connect with her for the Q&A. We will still have the Q&A session, but unfortunately, she just won't be able to be a part of that. Her presentation was on the topic of respect, respect for the self and respect for others. And it's a very interesting topic and very relevant to Caring for Life education, which is all about having respect for all living beings, and that includes ourselves. So it is unfortunate that we didn't have a chance to have her present with us today, but I'll do my very best to share some key points about their work, and hopefully I'll do it justice. So let me share my screen with you all. And maybe you can let me know if that works. Yeah, there we go. Great. Perfect. All right, so the group that was going to be joining us today, that would have been joining us today, was called the Global Schoolhouse Initiative. They're a charity based in Canada, and they focus on peace, education, and resilience training and education. And the topic of their discussion today would have been how respect for the self leads to respect for others. The presenter was supposed to be the CEO and founder of the Global Schoolhouse Initiative, and her name was Yasmin Spy. She earned her master's degree in counseling psychology, and she's a member of the Canadian Counseling and Psychotherapy Association. She worked as a counselor in Dubai in Canada, counseling families and high-functioning children with special needs, and taught social skills to children with special needs. She was instrumental in fundamentally restructuring the Dubai counseling program. Throughout her life and her career, she was increasingly aware of the recurring theme of resilience. So she created a charity called the Global Schoolhouse Initiative, and that provides free resilience education to children all over the world who are in impoverished and underserviced communities. The program educates children on how to be resilient so that the trauma of their already difficult lives do not define them, but rather get transformed into something that they draw strength from for the rest of their lives. So GSI, the Global Schoolhouse Initiative, they identified a major issue, and that was getting an education is nearly impossible for almost 50 million children living in impoverished and vulnerable communities. And providing mere food and shelter to those communities and to those children is often not enough because their communities often face additional difficulties related to trauma and economic and cultural obstacles. They found that these children needed an education and a source of strength and hope. The solution for them was peace education and resilience training. So what is resilience? It's a good outcome in the face of adversity. And this kind of education addresses both their emotional needs and their scholastic and intellectual needs. The goal was that they would not only acquire skills like reading, writing, and math, but also how to resolve conflicts, how to be leaders, how to cope with adversity, and how to become strong and resourceful adults. And they do this in a variety of ways. Some of the ways that their program accomplishes their goals are harnessing the use of technology in environments where traditional education isn't practical, facilitating supportive adult-child relationships, helping students concentrate on things beyond their basic needs and towards long-term goals, providing the program in local languages to foster respect for their culture, whilst focusing on global topics and universal emotional themes like compassion and empathy for the self and for others. So their classes challenge students to think, hang on here, I'm noticing that you may not be able to see these slides. Are you getting, Mavish, are you noticing that these slides are transitioning or no? No, okay, so we're having an issue with the slides here. So bear with me here, and I'm going to see if I can get those to play for you.
Our world is facing an education crisis on nearly every continent. Education is often regarded as a first world problem when it needs to be viewed as a...
So let's try this again here. Let's try this again. There we go. That seems like it's working better. All right, so this was just a recap of the issue that GSI had identified and the solution that they found for that. So the issue was the lack of education, and the solution was peace education and resilience training. There we go. And then we just briefly discussed the ways that they address those issues and achieve their goals. So harnessing technology, focusing on adult and child relationships, helping students concentrate on things beyond their basic needs and moving towards a long-term goal. And finally, making sure that they focus their program on providing it in their local language so children develop a respect for their own culture while still having access to global issues and learning about compassion and empathy. There we go. All right, so now we're caught up. So GSI's classes actually challenge students to think about how the world works while empowering them to see their role both within and beyond their communities. Children are able to develop a sense of self-efficacy both by mastering content, but also by building a better sense of their place in the world. And it is through peace education and resilience training that GSI encourages children to value their own worth and their future, and encourages them to value the worth of all living beings in their local and global communities. So now I will move forward and just show you a brief introductory video about GSI, and that should hopefully give you a little bit of background about the work that they do.
Our world is facing an education crisis on nearly every continent. Education is often regarded as a first world problem when it needs to be viewed as a global one. The goal of the Global Schoolhouse Initiative is to provide free education to any child in need, anywhere in the world. The program is centered around simplicity and sustainability, being plug and play in every aspect of the project. The Global Schoolhouse includes a computer-based curriculum complete with a laptop, a server, router, projector, and a secure housing unit. All lessons are scripted to to seamlessly infuse into any setting with remarkable success. All that is required is a literate individual willing to commit 1 hour a day to teach children in need. We consider our students' hardships and circumstances and provide them with the skills and strategies to cope and to grow as global citizens. Through GSI's theme-based curriculum, the content provided is essential, global, and culturally sensitive, delivered in the native language of the host community with a focus on resilience development and peace education. The program is not only designed to be power autonomous, but is also designed to minimize the use of mobile parts, making the units durable in any environment. GSI's role in any community is simple: to send out our product, provide basic training either in person or via internet meetings, and monitor remotely. Every child deserves an education, and with your help, we can give them one.
Great, so hopefully that gives everybody a brief introduction to GSI, and unfortunately she wasn't able to be here today to talk about self-respect and how respecting your own worth and respecting yourself actually encourages your ability to be able to respect others and all living beings. And I know she was very sorry that she couldn't be with us today, but hopefully we'll have another opportunity to welcome GSI another time. With that, if you do have any questions that you would have had for Yasmin, or that the very brief introduction, if that gave you any questions, please feel free to share those with us and we can pass those off to her, and hopefully she'll be able to provide some feedback for you all. So let's move on to our second session then. What I'd like to do is to invite all of the master trainers to get your red and green cards for our icebreaker activity. And for those attendees who are joining us online, then we will be launching a poll and you can participate in the icebreaker activities that way. So I'll wait for Mivish to launch that poll and let's get started. So the first question: is it possible for an animal to respect you? True for green, red for false. Okay. Second question: donkeys are stubborn. Green for true, red for false. It's my favorite when there's a mixture of answers. Okay. Third question: when donkeys are frightened, they run away. Green for true, red for false. I know I usually say there's no right answer to these questions, but in this case, there actually are some right and wrong answers. So we'll find out about that. Okay, fourth question. When donkeys are in pain, they, red, make a lot of noise, or green, are quiet and still. Okay. And last question. Donkeys sometimes develop very strong bonds with their companions. Green for true, red for false. Okay, great. So thank you. I think it's really fantastic when we see such a variety of responses, because my brain goes to a place where we're going to have some very interesting questions come up at the end of the session. So that's really great to see. I've heard these this charity present. Oh, thank you, Mivish, for posting those poll results. So it's pretty varied, which is kind of fantastic. So we'll have some interesting discussion here. I've heard this this charity present before, and quite frankly, they're quite phenomenal. They're known throughout the world as being one of the most phenomenal charities that exist out there, and I think may actually be one of the top performing charities in all of the UK. So they are very world renowned and have a lot of information that they can share with us. I've given that the reason that we've selected to have a presentation from this charity is because these incredible animals are very much a part of life in Pakistan, both in rural areas and in urban areas. And I think that the information should be quite thought-provoking for all of us, in that it may confirm or challenge a lot of the ideas that we have about these animals. And may be different than what we think is true, or confirm what we think is true. So let's dive right in. We're fortunate to have two presenters for this next session from the Donkey Sanctuary, which is based in the UK. Their first presenter, Tamlin Watson, she's been involved with wildlife conservation, animal welfare, and behavior for over 20 years. She has run her own businesses in these fields and has been involved with charities undertaking research to improve animal welfare, and has designed and implemented community-engaged dog population management programs to reduce wildlife and human conflicts with feral and free-ranging dog populations. Tamlin also works for the Donkey Sanctuary as a senior researcher within the global research team. The team have published numerous peer-reviewed articles evidencing the socioeconomic and cultural value of donkeys and mules in marginalized communities, the development of welfare assessment methods, equid owner access to resources, the impacts of infrastructure development on welfare, equid welfare in mountain communities in Nepal, and the capacities of drug retail workers in India, and the potential for antimicrobial resistance. She sounds very smart. For the UK-Europe team, she has been mapping the distribution of donkeys in dairy production and donkeys in the community in the UK. The second presenter, so there's two presenters from the Donkey Sanctuary today. The second presenter is Roger Cutting. He was an associate professor in education at the University of Plymouth in the UK for many years, where his teaching and research were centered around global education and education for sustainable development. He has published over 70 peer-reviewed publications and has produced 2 books, with a third due for publication late in 2020. So Roger, you'll have to let us know if that got published or not yet. He is a research fellow at the Center for Sustainable Futures and maintains a visiting readership at the Institute of Education with the University of Plymouth. Today, his primary role is the education lead for the Donkey Sanctuary, and a present interest is how non-human animals may provide a focus for development of alternative, compassion-based critical pedagogies that promote both sustainable development and environmental curation. So they have a pretty rich CV here. They're educators, researchers, academics, advocates, undoubtedly leaders in their fields. So I think we're quite privileged to have them here today. So Tamlin and Roger, I will turn it over to you and get to your presentation. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I can't see the Roger's screen, unfortunately.
I'll just share my screen now with you, Tamlin.
Yeah, I can, it's
Is it?
It's come. Don't you just love technology?
I think it also takes a moment, Tamlin. There we go.
Okay.
Yeah, there we go.
There we go. Okay, great. So if we can start at the first screen. Please.
I see. Yeah, I've got a different.
I see.
Okay.
Okay, so my name is Tamlin Watson. I've been working for the Sanctuary for a few years now. We're a charity that was set up in 1973 by Elizabeth Svensson and have been operating now, and we're now recognised as one of the world's leading authorities on all things donkeys and mule. There are estimated around 55 million donkeys in the world, and around 42 million of these are working animals. Next slide, please, Roger. So I'd like to begin this webinar talking about donkeys and why they behave the way they do, how that impacts how they're perceived, and ultimately how they're treated, particularly when thinking about trying to improve their welfare. Now, I'm aware that all of you will probably have experience of seeing donkeys day to day, and I hope this provokes some thought when you next see a donkey as to how, you know, have a look at their behavior and really start to notice them as individuals. Anyway, as you can see from these pictures, we've got donkeys and horses. So you can see horses living quite different environments compared to donkeys. And the differences in the environments they live in do shape their behaviour. So donkeys particularly have territories around 23 kilometres roughly. And so they've evolved to walk that distance minimum per day. Also, because of the type of forage materials available to them, they are in very limited supply. So these animals have to walk very far every day to get the limited amount of forage materials that they can possibly get. As a result of this, they have become incredibly efficient at converting their food into energy for themselves, which is great in the arid environments that they've evolved in, but not so great in the UK, because we do have problems with donkey obesity, because our grass is incredibly rich. So because of this lack of food availability and lack of water availability, their herd structures are very different to horses. So donkeys, if there are really loads of food resources available, their herd structure can rise up to about 100 individuals. And then as those resources dwindle, their numbers can go right down to 2 or even 1 individual. Compared to horses, who have access to really good food supplies, really species-rich grasslands. So because of that, they can support, that environment can support the herd structures, very stable herd structures for horses. So this impacts their behaviour in the longer term, both donkeys and horses. So because donkeys' herd structures can't be maintained and they're very fluid, they've developed certain characteristics. So not only physical characteristics. Can we go on to the next slide, please, Rog? So we've got some really physical characteristics in donkeys, things that you all recognise, I'm sure. So we've got the enormous ears. One of the things that those ears help with is they can hear up to 96 kilometres away. So over those those massive distances, donkeys can keep in touch with each other, which they need to if their herd structures are so dispersed. And their bray can carry around 3 kilometres, which is really important for keeping individuals in the know about where they all are. Now, the other thing that donkeys are known for is not really showing an awful lot. If you're not used to looking at donkeys, you might think, well, they don't really show a lot of behaviour. They're very stoic. So there's a really good reason for this. So when if an animal is living in a very unstable herd structure, so it becomes very, it needs to protect itself out in the wild. So an animal that shows that it's vulnerable, shows that it's perhaps poorly, not very well, is very vulnerable to attack from predators. So donkeys will mask any issues they have, which makes it very difficult for owners, particularly, to know what is going on with their animal. So compared to horses that are in very stable herd structures, if they need to escape a predator, they'll just run because they've got safety in numbers. Donkeys have to do things a little bit differently. So if a donkey is perhaps startled or frightened by something, it won't run very far. It might just step a few feet away, stop, turn around and look at what's frightened it. So, and it will tend to use more defense mechanisms rather than running away. So next slide, please, Roger. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about sentience in donkeys. Now, donkeys have got their own personalities, and just because they don't show a lot doesn't mean there isn't loads of stuff going on in there. So donkeys do get really stressed, and although signs can be really subtle, it can be really easy to miss, but they are very sensitive creatures, they're very intelligent creatures. So next time you see a donkey, it'd be really good to just have a look and see what you're looking at. So when you see a donkey perhaps run a little bit away from something, have a look at what its body language is telling you. You'll see their bodies tense. If they get very stressed, they reduce their food intake. They can perhaps withdraw, go really quiet, and this can be really overlooked by people. So one really good example is colic in donkeys. When you compare it to horses, horses will look at their flanks, they'll perhaps roll, they'll sweat, whereas donkeys will become really quiet, very still, and reduce their food intake. Similar responses can be seen when a donkey's in pain. So all that might be externally visible is perhaps a tightening in the facial muscles, a narrowing of the eyes, and perhaps a change in its breathing. It makes it really difficult for owners to assess pain, but this skill can be learned. And if an owner has enough time, they can spend time getting to know their own animals, and they'll understand what's right behaviour for their own animal. Everyone is slightly different. Animals got their personalities too. I'll touch later on in this talk. I'll just talk briefly about the limitations that some owners have about the time that they can spend with their animals. So another time you might see a donkey get really stressed is bonding. So where we've talked about the way they've evolved, you might start to think that, okay, well, donkeys must have evolved to accept some degree of social isolation, thinking back to their herd structures. However, domesticated donkeys can very strongly pair bond. So when it doesn't happen with every donkey, but an awful lot of donkeys it does. So they develop a strong companionship, and any degree of separation can cause the animal quite a lot of stress. So when you think about perhaps an owner that wants to take one of their donkeys to a vet, even just that degree of separation for a short period of time can be enough to cause quite an extreme stress response in donkeys, and it can lead to a fatal condition called hypolipemia. Donkeys do bond with other species too. We've had all sorts at the donkey sanctuary. We've had them bonded to chickens, cats, goats, sheep, and horses and ponies, but they do most strongly pair bond to their own species. So, as I mentioned before, donkeys do feel fear, but they quite often exhibit something different than we're expecting to see. Much more subtle responses, and because of this, it can be really easy to overlook their behaviour and dismiss it. So the lack of running away from an issue or the more defensive behaviour might make owners perhaps think that their animals are being unafraid and they're being difficult or challenging, a bit naughty, and so the donkeys then don't get the proper support and understanding that they need to overcome difficulties that they might be facing. So very briefly, I just want to mention a bit more of a positive emotion, which is joy. And although a lot of working donkeys maybe haven't got the capacity to feel that, because most of them work very hard, we do see it a lot in the UK, and part of their enrichment process in the sanctuary is to give them toys and things to play with. So things that they can grab in their mouths and run off with. Owners regularly tell us about how clever they feel their donkeys are. Their donkeys might open doors, open gates, steal objects, try and elicit play with their owners. And these are all the product of a highly inquisitive, highly intelligent mind. I think it's important to remember that donkeys do feel and exhibit a similar range of emotions to what we humans do. Next slide, please, Roger. So, having said all that, unfortunately, there is a misconception with donkeys. People misread their behaviour all the time. And because of that, they're labelled as stubborn, as stupid, lazy. They're usually linked to low status, they're classed as a low status animal, and are quite often linked to the poorer, most marginalised communities as well. So donkeys throughout the ages have been much maligned and ridiculed, and their stoicism, general behaviour, their large ears, their unusual vocalizations, and their small stature sort of being associated with quite comic characterizations. So in India, where I've worked fairly recently, where people are subject to the rigours of the caste system, animals actually fall onto a hierarchy as well. And true to form, donkeys are classed in a similar standing to those lowest in society. And this stigma perpetuates throughout different societies. We even see it in the UK to an extent as well, where they are classed as lower status than perhaps their horse relations. So yeah, adaptations that serve donkeys well in the wild create all sorts of problems for them in domesticated settings, and that's where a lot of these labels come from. So perhaps a donkey refusing to walk into a vehicle to be transported, for instance, might be labelled stupid or stubborn, when all it's doing is trying to avoid the tiger that might be lurking in the gloom. This donkey being labelled as stupid, if it was just given some time to problem solve and assess what could potentially be a life-threatening issue for it, would make all the difference. So when I talked about pain just now, the lack of visible signs of pain in a donkey can make an owner fail to correctly assess or to get any health interventions from vets, because they just don't know, they just don't see that their animal isn't quite right. And this could negatively influence the donkey's behaviour in the longer term, making the equid less willing to work. And this might escalate physical interactions with the owner, and in the longer term could influence the animal's value or worth as a means to generate income. So this language that's used to ridicule or denigrate donkeys is also used to ridicule and denigrate people. So where someone is considered unskilled or stupid, they might be called a jackass or a donkey. And to add to this, many communities that are relying on working donkeys to support their livelihoods are usually the most marginalised, low status, poor communities who also suffer very similar stigma. Next slide, please, Roger. So social and economic factors affect the ability of people to make good choices and can significantly affect human health and the health of any dependents. And by dependents, I don't just mean children, but I mean the animals reliant on their daily care. In fact, individuals in extreme poverty tend to spend so much time concentrating and worrying about their immediate problems of surviving that they're quite often left with a limited capacity to deal with other tasks. And this limited capacity has been shown in studies to influence the mental capacity of those in extreme poverty. And this resulting cognitive deficit means they quite often make mistakes or bad choices. And these bad decisions can negatively impact their financial position and ultimately the welfare of their animals, their working animals. And it ultimately leaves communities less able to adapt and face further challenges. So I recently worked with the Vanjara and Salat communities in India, in the brick kilns. Both are considered really low status within Indian society, and because of that they are unable to diversify employment and they're forced to live on agriculturally poor land, so they can't even, they struggle to feed themselves. Working with these particular communities in brick kilns, you find that because they're marginalised and due to transient work availability, they are to some level migratory, and this impacts their access to social support, and their access to education is very limited. This migratory life means they spend large parts of the year away from their own familiar communities, so away from their own social support, but often in regions of India where they don't even share a common language. This situation particularly affects women who rarely receive any training in animal husbandry, despite being expected to care for their animals in the frequent labour absences of their husbands. And most training resources are directed at men, and unfortunately this doesn't always filter, the information doesn't always filter down to other animal caregivers. And this lack of knowledge transfer has implications, particularly in these communities where social stratification means it creates barriers to information. And this encourages a sort of familial self-reliance, which means that this sort of inherited knowledge is then relied upon for animal husbandry. And unfortunately, this path of knowledge transfer perpetuates beliefs or information that may not have any bearing in actual good management or good husbandry, and so it has obvious implications for equid welfare. One interesting thing we did find in our research recently was actually those communities or owners using very compassionate language towards their animals actually did show better welfare. So I think the take-home message is we all have our own bias. We all, whether we know it or not, create our own judgments about particular people or particular situations. And I think it's really important that we familiarize ourselves with ourselves, so that we are very present and understand that when we are working with communities, that we leave that bias, if we can, at the door. So in a nutshell, donkeys are strong, hardworking, resilient, sharing attributes for the tough, marginalised communities who rely on them. So I'd like to hand over to Roger now, who will discuss the role of donkeys and how this can create more sustainable communities.
Okay. Thanks, Tamlin. Well, that's a really nice review. It sets me up well for the next few slides, really, because Tamlin's established the fact that we have this these very, very intriguing animals that are very close to us in our everyday lives. And you could actually trace that relationship back over 6,000 years. If you look at reliefs from ancient Mesopotamia or ancient Egypt, you can see depictions of donkeys carrying out functions that are exactly the same as they carry out today in certain parts of the world, such as East Africa or South America, or as the pictures that Tamlin has just shown in India. This relationship, this working relationship between us and donkeys is something that goes back almost to the birth of civilization. And so it's a very strong relationship, one which has a great antecedents. But of course, one of the things that we're interested these days in perhaps is not so much just the future of our past relationships, but also our future relationships. And unfortunately, I'm going to have to just pause for a second because my PowerPoint presentation is locked up. So I'm just gonna stop sharing for a second and try and find what's happened to it. Hang on. So I can see you all now. It's just going to try and find a different version of it. I think that's the one I'm after. So I think that's it. There we go. Phew, that's a relief. I wasn't panicking at all. You know, so having established this past relationship that we have with donkeys, so these very intriguing animals, I suppose the next thing to do is to think about our future relationship with them, because if education is about anything, it's about the future. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which we've only got 9 more years before we need to have achieved them. And I guess one of the things I want to do next is to consider some of the ways in which donkeys that have contributed significantly to our past and contribute to our present will be able to contribute to our futures as well. And I'll sort of pose the question to you. I mean, in which ways can donkeys help us to achieve these Sustainable Development Goals? Now, this is something that we do a lot with students in this country, because donkeys are largely invisible to most people living in the UK and in Europe and North America. For yourselves in Pakistan, obviously you're much more visible in your lives. So you may well be familiar with some of these issues, but I'm just going to run through a whole series of slides very, very quickly now. So hang on tight, because this is going to be a very rapid journey through a number of pictures to illustrate how these animals may help us to develop a sustainable future. So let's start off by some of the easy ones then. I suppose the most straightforward are things like access to resources, particularly water. And these are the normal traditional photos you see and pictures you see of donkeys in East Africa bringing water to villages. But of course, this is in South America, water being used in the favelas, the shanty towns in the major conurbations. This is in Europe. So again, donkeys and mules really important in the supply of water and resources. Where there are no donkeys, water has to be carried manually. A donkey can bring water for a village for the day. An individual person can perhaps only bring water for their family. So donkeys are really important for resources in terms of health and access to healthcare as well. This is a special saddle that's been designed. The woman in this photo is pregnant, and she's been taken down on a specially designed saddle to the hospital. So again, the access to health resources. So we've got access to water, access to resources, access to health. Health again. This is in China. These are COVID-19 tests being delivered in central China through, as you can see, highly inclement weather. Actually, that looks like the UK today. It's the reason I've got this big jumper on is it's absolutely freezing outside and snowing. But as you can see, again, access to the access to health resources in isolated areas. Productive farming, the move towards zero hunger and responsible food consumption as sustainable development goals. Donkeys are incredibly important in agriculture, both in terms of turning soil, the production of manure, and also this access to markets as well, and empowering women. So number 5, gender equality of sustainable development goals. How do donkeys empower women? I mean, we do an activity at the university where we put a picture of a donkey on the floor of the room, and then we ask the students to put the sustainable development goal cards close to the donkey if they think that it can contribute to that sustainable development goal, and further away across the room if they don't think it can contribute to it. Without fail, empowering women is always the one that's the furthest away. The students put the furthest away because they don't see the importance of the presence of donkeys freeing up time for women to take part in governance of communities. Where there are donkeys, women take a greater role in the governance of a community. Where there are no donkeys, unfortunately, women spend most of the time carrying water. So there's a really important aspect of social liberation as well with donkeys. Again, going back to the plough scene there, but also the brick kilns, the importance of the donkey in transporting goods and bricks away from these areas to marketplaces. And of course, when you don't have donkeys, you end up with this. So in terms of the economic development and economic sustainability and access to markets and so forth, donkeys are really important. And again, one of the things allied to this particular picture is also of human health as well. Enabling education, really important quality education. And I'm going to look specifically at this moment in time at things like access again. So access to schools. This is a mobile library. These are quite commonplace these days. This one again, this is in Zimbabwe. Another children's library going out to rural schools. This is Biblioburo. This is in South America. Again, a mobile library. This is in South Africa. This guy actually takes out solar-powered computer screens to rural schools, and the kids get to go online and get to explore the internet in really rural areas in Southern Africa. So again, donkeys and mules are really important for accessing education, quality education, improving the quality of education in these rural areas, and strengthening livelihoods, decent work, economic growth, no poverty, not just in brick kilns, but in agroforestry as well, building resilience for communities. Again, resilience, we talked about, I think, at the very beginning of the introduction today. This is a photo in Pakistan. These are people leaving an earthquake zone, right? And the animal that's taken them out is a donkey. Going the other way, of course, is the Pakistani army using mules to take relief aid into the same area. So you've got donkeys and mules taking people out, and taking aid and medical resources in at the same time. So they're really important in terms of environmental crises. Again, in East Africa, the great droughts that are seemingly commonplace in East Africa these days, being alleviated by donkeys that are drought-adapted animals themselves. Those pictures you saw of that Tamlin showed earlier on, they are evolved in, to live in semi-desertic conditions. So they are drought-adapted. They're perfect to taking resources into semi-arid environments. So in terms of alleviating drought, they're really important. They've got a really important role to play. And this is this donkey is contributing, as you can see, to social justice again. And of course, what this donkey is carrying is, what this donkey is carrying are ballot boxes for elections in Afghanistan. Right? So taking ballot boxes and allowing political participation way out in rural areas. Right? And then, of course, when we've got energy as well, clean, affordable energy, bringing wood fuel, biodigestion for methane. And these biodigestion can produce methane gas for cooking facilities. And so as we run through, you can see that donkeys have. I hope that very, very rapid run through those slides gives you some indication of the importance that donkeys have in relation to future resilience and future sustainability, not just present and past. And I think it's very easy as educationalists, and this is the important point. So this is where you have to listen. Right? It's very easy for us as educationalists to rationalise about the importance of donkeys and to recognise that kind of rational importance. But as we said right at the very beginning in the introduction, mainstream education does tend to concentrate very much on the cognitive. It's all about cognitive development. Accelerated cognition in children is a major research area. Right? But if you look at alternative education, something like Steiner-Waldorf education, for example, you'll see this phrase used a great deal. This idea that education is about head, heart, and hands, and the head that's the cognitive. And I'd argue that perhaps over 80% of education, mainstream education, is about cognitive development. The hands, that's the dexterous manual, that's the building and craft aspects of education, perhaps the other 20%. We're very good at cognitive development, we're very good at dexterous manual development, but where's the emotional development? And when we think about education, right, perhaps we need to sort of think, given that we've only got 9 years to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, given the recent State of the Planet report that some of you might have read and might have seen, we know that things are pretty poor and getting worse. So how does education, what can we do to move things forward? How we can be better achieve those Sustainable Development Goals? We can certainly rationalise, as I said, about the importance of animals and the importance of strategies. But to save the planet, as I've said here, this is something that you're going to need to do, because I've failed. All right, my generation's failed. I'm really, really old. I am so incredibly old. I've taught for hundreds of years, and I've taught environmental education. I started off teaching environmental science, and then I taught environmental education for about 16, 17 years. And in a career that spans about 35 years of environmental science, environmental education, the condition of the planet has got worse and worse and worse year on year. So by any kind of simple metric of analysis, I have failed. Right? So I'm passing the problem over to you lot as the next generation of jobbing teachers. Right? And I think one of the important things we need to bear in mind here, and this is a question I was going to ask initially, is perhaps there seems to be a received wisdom that more education is a good thing. That the more education we have, the better. Right? And I'd argue against that, right? Because I don't think, and I'm sure some of you might have read, might be familiar with David Orr's work, but I very much agree with David Orr that the world is not being destroyed by ignorance. If you look at the top 20 most polluting companies in the world, right, 20 global companies produce nearly 40% of carbon emissions on the planet. just 20 companies producing 40% of CO2 emissions. And 8 of those companies have CEOs that have got MBAs from the Harvard Business School. The planet's not being destroyed by ignorance. It's being destroyed by some of the most educated, qualified people in the world. It's not the quantity of education that's important here. We don't want the same sort of education, because that's the sort of education that's got us into this situation. What we need is not more education. We need a different type of education, right? And that's the really key thing. It's not the quantity, it's the quality, it's the nature of education. Now, cognitive development is really, really important. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that we should abandon everything in the curriculum. But I think when it comes to sustainability, when we come to thinking about a sustainable, just world, emotional development is equally as important. In other words, we have to learn to care. We have to have that aspect of compassion. And you may have come across, I'm sure you've come across some of these quotes and some of these people before. The top left there is E.O. Wilson, the American biologist. And E.O. Wilson coined the term biophilia, the love of living things. And this is what he described as the innately emotional affiliation of human beings to other living organisms. And he argued that we have to develop biophilia in children and young people. We have to develop their love of living things, not just their kind of rational connection. And then we have Babadium, the Senegalese conservationist, who said that in the end we'll only conserve what we love. Right? Again, we'll only love what we understand, and we understand what we are taught. So understanding the world around us is a really good way of promoting our love of it. And both Wilson and Diop argue that we need that emotional investment in living things around us. And I suppose this last reference here of Karen Kellett's book, which is a sort of classic really of 15 years ago, Children and Nature, when they talk about the importance of nurturing environmental love, and that concept of biophilia can be achieved particularly in young children with that nurturing relationship with animals. The animals provide a fantastic entree into compassion and care, and I think that's a really, really key. That's a really, really key point. And I think I'd probably argue that animals provide that access point, and it's so important that that's there, because if we can't care for the sentient creatures around us, how do we care for the non-sentient earth? Right? If we can't connect with living things around us, those sentient creatures, if we can't encourage children to care for the animals around them, how can we encourage them to care for the planet? If we don't have curation of their local environment, of animals and living things, in their local environment, how can we promote a global curation? And I think that's the important key point here. And I think compassionate education, although hasn't had much traction in Europe, it's largely developed in North America, is a really, really interesting entree and a really, really interesting concept in terms of developing a more compassionate view of the world around us. And I think is that, as I said, that emotional development as well as the cognitive, that different type, that re-emphasizing, refocusing of education, which is going to be so important going forward in the next 9 to 10 years. And I think that's my last slide. So that's the swipe through 600 slides in 10 minutes.
Thank you, Roger, for maybe it's all those decades of experience that you have that you deem unsuccessful, but that have really gotten you to cover such a vast amount of information in a short time.
Yeah, centuries of teaching.
Centuries. I'll get you to stop sharing your screen here, or I can just do it myself here. There we go. So thanks. I have to say, Roger, that, you know, I, as a previous educator decades ago myself, I find it really fascinating when you get the opportunity to really have your previous notions about something challenged and see the world from a different way. I always grew up thinking donkeys were stubborn, for example, so which I think is a very common conception about them. So kind of getting those factoids and that information to understand that indeed that's not the case, and understanding that there's more information behind that is always an exciting opportunity for me, and I assume for anyone who's in the educational field. And I think it's particularly relevant in Pakistan because, you know, donkeys are so much a part of the culture in urban and rural areas, and it's a great message that we can share with the youth in the country. So thank you, Roger. Thank you, Tamlin, for I found very fascinating presentation. With that, we will move on to our Q&A session, and I see that we have a bunch of questions popping in here. We do have one question for GSI, and I think what we'll do is I have passed that message, that question on to Yasmin while Roger and Tamlin were presenting. So if I get a response back for that, then I will share that. Otherwise, we will leave that on hold for the time being. All right, so Roger and Tamlin, I'm just going to leave this to you to decide who answers what question, but I'll pose it to you, and we'll see. So one question we have here is, do donkeys really die due to mental health?
Can I answer that?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's not purely due to mental health, but it's to stress. It's linked to stress. So they can come down with a condition called hypolipemia, which basically, if they go through any stress, so that stress could be a separation from a companion, it could be a trauma, it could be pain, it could be an illness. And it basically, the condition causes them to reduce their food intake, and that reduction in food intake then triggers the body to start to release fats within the body to provide the calories that the animal needs. And unfortunately, donkeys aren't very good at shutting that off. So what happens is those fats that are mobilized within the blood then start to build up within organs, particularly the liver, and start to shut the organs down. So it can be fatal. If you catch it in time and give the animal fluid food, you can overcome it, but it is a thing. It's more likely to happen in populations that are carrying more weight, but it can happen anywhere. So yeah, not necessarily just mental health, but it's linked to stress, and that stress could be any underlying factor really that might cause it pain.
Which is interesting, because I think it's a similar issue that humans face as well, that when stress and traumatic circumstances exist, and I think it's too bad that we didn't get to speak to this in the first presentation about resilience, but trauma and adverse conditions in your environment can also create high levels of stress in human beings, and therefore affect their physical health and their mental health and well-being as well. So it's a very universal condition, I think.
It is, yeah.
Okay, we have some fantastic questions popping in here. All right, so can you address why donkeys are seen as a cheap commodity?
Who's going to answer that? Me or you?
Whoever wants to.
Oh, you go on, Tam. You know. Sort of.
Okay, so like I talked about in my section, over the years, their status has always been very low. They're always classed as sort of the poor cousin of the equid world. So although they're real small powerhouses, they're incredibly strong for their size. Their stature and the visual appearance of them has always attracted ridicule. And I think because of that low status, it's always kept them low status within communities. So people who want an equine, perhaps the higher status people that want an equine, will always tend to go for horses. Now, horses and mules, as a rule, are more expensive to buy. So, which again is probably linked to status as well. So donkeys are always the cheapest, easiest, and with that comes the cheapest, easiest kind of throwaway animal. So, oh, it's broken, let's get another one. Obviously, that's changing a little bit now. I won't go into all the details of it. It's changing a little bit now because of the skins trade, which is impacting the value of donkeys worldwide. But as a general rule, because they're such low status animals, they're just seen as a cheap commodity. Not by everybody, obviously. For some communities, for a lot of the poor communities, it costs a lot of money to replace that animal. But that's basically why.
There's another question here that's related to that, so maybe I'll jump to that. Is there a reason that donkeys compared to horses are not considered high status, or why horses are considered high status compared to donkeys, even though they do come from a similar family?
I think again, it's just historically, donkeys have come in and out of fashion. But historically, they've always been the comic cousin, and so they've always been the butt of jokes, and that has always kept them low status. So you will never see a king riding about on a donkey, or I can't imagine you would. It will always be a horse because they always look regal and amazing, and I think that's it. Just seems to follow the donkeys everywhere they go. They're always classed as a beast of burden. They're never the ones that get to go to the party, really.
Soon, one day, we hope.
Yeah, they deserve it.
Okay, here's another question. It's commonly said, and you did touch on this a little bit, but it is commonly said that donkeys are stubborn. What is the basis for this reputation?
Okay, so shall I do this one again, Rog?
Absolutely. I'm just going to sleep for a while.
So this goes back to their behaviour, purely their behaviour. So because they don't live in stable herd structures, they have developed a really, really good self-preservation. So which obviously it impacts their workability. So they really need to trust their owner, and that they need a really good bond with their owner. And an awful lot of owners, because animals are passed around, particularly donkeys passed from pillar to post, it's quite difficult for donkeys to develop that bond, that trust. And also because their workload is quite high, there's quite a lot of pressure on owners to work their donkeys too. Quite often that handling becomes quite aversive, quite harsh and inhumane, or it can do, not always, but it can do, which makes the donkey trust that owner less and less all the time. So when you're asking a donkey to do a particular, it might be a new task you're asking it to do. You might be asking it to walk down a road. It might see a change in colour. So there might be, maybe somebody spilt some water on the road, which makes it look a slightly different colour. Donkey's eyesight and their perception will make it stop. And it'll look at that change in substrate because it doesn't want to walk itself into a hole, potentially. So it needs a moment or two to just have a look at what's going on. Now, owners will then label that donkey as stubborn because it's not moving forward fast enough. And instead of taking a step back and looking at assessing the situation and going, okay, he needs a moment to assess this road, give him a moment. They try and push them on, and that animal then, because it doesn't want to move, gets labeled as stubborn or difficult, and that's the bottom line. These animals need to assess their environment. Anything new in it, if they were in the wild, if there was a new thing in that environment, that new thing in the environment could be potentially life-threatening. They do not want to get eaten by the lion or the tiger. They have to assess, and you have to give them room to assess. And most of the time, they're never given that room to assess. They're pushed on, or the owner will try to push them on.
So here's a good follow-up question from one of our attendees. What are the best things owners can do to keep their donkeys happy and healthy then?
Okay, so all the things that we need, all things that we need as people. So access to a good diet, access to companionship. They are social animals. You should never leave them alone. Access to water when they need it, access to rest, some degree of freedom to forage. And this is quite difficult in a lot of the environments they live in. But for their own mental well-being, they have evolved to forage. They have evolved to wander around looking for food, and giving them that ability. So people taking them out to graze, for instance, really helps their mental well-being. Teaching the owners how to correctly handle them and to correctly care for them. Mm-hmm. Those are all the things that will keep your donkey happy and healthy.
Okay, so this is again a sort of an extension of that question. The question is, do donkeys show aggression? If yes, then how do they show their anger? And in such cases, what would be the most humane way to deal with a behavior issue with a donkey, given that a very common observation around the world is caning? Can you share some knowledge about that?
Oh gosh, I can't. It's quite difficult to be really specific about it because there's so many variables. But donkeys will show aggression. It's usually defensive. So usually, like I said earlier, people mistake that for an animal being a bit challenging, a bit difficult, but actually it's probably a result of an animal being a bit afraid of what's going on. So how they might show that, they might pull at a face at you. So they might put their ears back and bare their teeth. They might use more offensive behavior. They might move into your space. They might try and kick you. And donkeys are quite good at kicking in all directions. So they don't just kick backwards, they'll kick forwards or sideways too. Mm. But it's trying to bear in mind that the animal is frightened of what you're trying to do. And that might be a result of past experiences. Mm. Or you might be trying to push it into a situation where you haven't given it the space to decide what it's doing, or whether you haven't given it the chance to assess the situation, and you're trying to push it too hard. And what I would say is just back off a minute, step back, give everyone a bit of space, give it time to relax a little bit more, and then move back into the space to talk to it and see it, give it a scratch and see if it'll come round. But an awful lot is just not giving that animal time to breathe, to think, to move.
It's like dealing with an angry family member, a husband or wife or child, right? When they're in a grumpy mood or having a temper, you just need to give it a minute.
Yeah, give it a bit of room.
Just exactly. Give it a minute.
I mean, there's so many different ways of dealing with that, what you class as aggressive behaviour, but it's about giving them room, really, and space. A lot of these animals have had very, very harsh handling for a very long time. And it's about giving them the chance to breathe and perhaps learn to trust you a little bit. And that takes time sometimes.
Time's the really key element, isn't it? I mean, the behaviourists, the behaviourist specialists at the Donkey Sanctuary spend an awful lot of time with donkeys that have, as Tamlin said, have been treated really, really poorly, for years of abuse. So it really does. It's really small steps a lot of the time. Just getting the donkey just used to your presence, even, not even touching it, no. and then gradually, just rewarding positive behaviour, these slow incremental steps, eventually pay benefits. The donkey will begin to interact, but it does take time.
I mean, even just going in and feeding it can quite often, over time, start to more positively associate you with something enjoyable, rather than just being really hands off with them for quite a while.
They do recognize people. That's the other thing. So they do begin to associate people with certain things.
So let's take that a little bit further then. So if it's really about engaging with a donkey differently than we would otherwise think to engage with them, I'll combine two questions here. So how do we help change mindsets about donkeys? How do we destigmatize them?
Well, something that we do, that's my job really, is to change mindsets around donkeys as education lead in the Donkey Sanctuary. And we can do that by simply telling people, I go out to universities and colleges and do similar kind of presentations to what I've done here, but I've always found it far more effective to get the students into the sanctuary and get them up close to the donkeys, and actually work with the animals themselves rather than, as I was saying in the presentation, really. I think there's a big divide between the rational and the emotional. If we're going to engage emotion, then you need to engage the contact, the proximity, the environment is really, really important in that emotional development. And getting, I think the most profound reactions we've had from students is when they actually come into the sanctuary and they work with the animals, rather than me going out and showing pictures and sort of saying, aren't they wonderful? It's a completely different qualitative education experience when the students come in and work with the animals.
I would like to ask a question here, Roger. Since education and emotional intelligence are so important, what are some of the ways we can encourage this in classroom with the students? Also, how can we get students to care for beings like donkeys when the culture that they are raised in considers donkeys an animal which is disliked and are biased towards them?
Yeah, well, that's a really, really good question. That's a fantastic question, because it's so difficult to answer. To the point I'm not even sure if I can. But I think one of the most important things is initially, at least, with that sense of curation around sentient beings, is their proximity. So in the UK we have things called care farms where children can go out to farms and work with animals and of all different types. Animals can be brought into the schools, although there are issues around that. But the proximity of animals and the commitment of children to look after those animals and to care for those animals is really, really important. There's a whole range of strategies in the UK about animals in schools. I think that the really difficult question is that socially context one that you just mentioned there, that cultural context, and that's a much deeper problem to try to overcome. I think, when you're in a culture that has these kind of attitudes, but attitudinal change is one of the core aspects of education, isn't it? I mean, you think about how my attitudes, even, in my, having said I'm 600 years old, think about how our attitudes have changed in the last 20 years to things. I mean, attitudes aren't, attitudinal change isn't impossible. It happens all the time. Attitudes are fluid. I guess the trick is to channel and control the direction. So you just need to, I think it's about challenging things. I think it really is about challenging the status quo. I think in terms of compassion, it's about proximity and about engaging different kinds of learning beyond the cognitive. And I think in terms of cultural context, it has to be a very slow process, certainly a bit like changing the behavior of a donkey. It's a slow process. It takes time. And I think those attitudinal changes in cultural context take time as well, but they need to be challenged, I think.
You may have answered this next question already now in your response, Roger, but I'll ask it anyways because it is a very good question. Currently, children are getting better opportunities, versatile gadgets, and every modern thing that an educational institute can provide. However, sometimes they're not very compassionate or kind to the environment or animals. Is there something wrong with the current education system, or is it just human nature to always oppress the weak? It's a fantastic question.
It's a brilliant question. Who asked that?
Zafreen from the Karachi office. I don't know if we can see her on the camera, but you can wave. It's a fantastic question. There she is.
I can see you. Yeah.
Very good question.
Sure. This is your moment. I don't know. I think education's in crisis. So I really do. I'm not the only one to think that. I mean, I mentioned David Orr. I mean, he wrote a seminal work. I'm sure many of you are familiar with, called Earth in Mind, almost over 25 years ago now. And the first chapter of that book is called Bad Education, and it's about how education is fundamentally flawed. So Ken Robinson recently on a TED talk talking about the crisis in education. That we're removing the creativity, we're removing the emotional, we're removing the quality of education. We have news stories in the UK, and I'm sure you have them in Pakistan, about children in Korea who are maths geniuses at the age of 9 or 10, and that sounds to me like almost a form of child abuse. You know, what on earth is a kid at 8 or 9 doing higher level maths 8-9 hours a day in school? You know, where's the joy? You know, where's the that sense of freedom, that sense of adventure? So yeah, I think education is really in a crisis at the moment, and I think that's the point I was making earlier about achieving a sustainable and just world. I think education has a vital role to play in that, but it's got to be a different type of education to the one that we've been pushing for the last 20 to 30 years.
And I think it's, it's a great point, Roger, because I think that's the main reason we're here, right? I mean, when we're talking about caring for life education, we're talking about providing children with a different kind of education, that we're not just addressing core subjects in a very rote learning manner, but we're rather encouraging children to be in a context in school where they are developing critical thinking skills, thinking about the world around them, engaging with the world around them, and learning how to take those values that they learn and extend them into their greater communities and into the global context, and be caring citizens and compassionate human beings. And so I think that's why programs like this are sincerely so valuable.
I think that's right. But I think when I was, when my children were small, I used to have to go to parents' evenings in the schools. You know, the parents get called in, and you talk to the teachers about how your children are progressing. And I always used to dread these things, these parents events. You know, because I was a sort of professor in education, going in to talk about the progress of my children, and it was always that your son has got this score in maths, and they've done this in English, and they've done this in history, and it was all academic. These are 8, 9, 10-year-old children, and we're assessing them on simple cognitive metrics. There was nothing about the social and emotional development, how many friends they'd got, how they related to other people or to the world around them. It was purely that narrowly defined curriculum metric analysis, which is educationally lazy, I think, because that's the simplest thing to test, isn't it? Can you count? Do you know your 3 times table? That's really, really easy to evaluate. What kind of level of compassion do you have to that donkey over there is much more difficult to evaluate. And that's the challenge.
We're really putting the master trainers to the test here, because at the end of the day, I mean, we're talking about educators here. So it's really quite a challenge for all of you, I think, to not just share critical thinking methods and inquiry thinking methods to the students, but to experience them ourselves as well, and to challenge ourselves and those ideas that we have, and so that we're better equipped to be able to share that with students in the classroom. So it's I think this is unexpectedly a shift in the discussion, but I think a very valuable one when we talk about education.
If you're interested in the research frontier, I did a paper a year or so ago when I did a content analysis of all the research papers in environmental education, and there were something like about 350, 400 papers, research papers, and only 3 dealt with animals.
Wow.
And there were the 6 major research publications in environmental education. Only 3 papers dealt with animals.
Well, you have to live a little longer, Roger, so you can write some more. Huh? We really have some other fantastic questions, and I'm keeping an eye on the clock. So I think what we'll do is we'll limit it to the final 3 questions that I see here on this list, because they're very good. So a more practical question, steering a little bit away from education just for a moment. If donkeys are stopped from working, wouldn't it affect the environment and be not environmentally friendly, because the alternatives would be machines?
I don't think we want them to stop working. I think making sure that their welfare is good is the key, isn't it? Because an awful lot of communities throughout the globe rely on donkeys. They're culturally part of life in so many countries, and they will continue to be as long as they're there, I guess. But I think making sure that their welfare and well-being is supported is the key to making sure that they're sustainable within communities. Anything to add, Roger?
No, I agree entirely. I mean, work at the Donkey Sanctuary is often about working animals. and how those animals, as I demonstrated in the hopefully demonstrated in the presentation, how important donkeys are, working animals, working equids are to communities around the world. And it's not the work that's the issue, it's the welfare.
Another question is, what are your thoughts on, due to global economic pressure, will donkeys be able to survive in the next 20 to 25 years or be an endangered species?
Well, if the skin trade continues, I think they may well be endangered.
Yeah. The skin trade's the biggest threat to the donkey population, I think.
And I just actually want to pose a question to all the MTs out there, just out of my own selfish curiosity, just with a raise of hands. How many of you are actually aware of the donkey skin trade in Pakistan?
Oh, okay. Should we give them?
Maybe that might be an opportunity just for 1 minute to just give a brief introduction to that. I'm 1 minute is a very limited time to address that, but just in the interest of time, maybe we could share something about that.
Yeah, sure. Which one of us knows enough?
Oh, go on, Tam.
Okay, right. So basically, in China, there is a demand for a product called a jiao, which is a product made from the ground up skins of donkeys. Years ago, it used to be linked to, well, it is linked to status. It all comes back to status. So it was linked to status, but weirdly, it was linked to very high status people. So a jiao was very much a part of rich society. As China's become more affluent, those that are sort of the up and coming people working their way up the ladder want a piece of it. So because of that, demand has skyrocketed for the product, which has increased demand worldwide. So I think demand is around 10 million donkeys a year. I might be wrong, but I think that's about right. Now, a lot of the routes to get the donkey skins are following illegal wildlife trade routes as well. And it's far-reaching, so it doesn't just impact donkeys in China, it's impacting donkeys globally. So unfortunately, because it's worth so much money, it's comparable to gold, I think. I'd heard.
Gold.
Yeah, it's worth an awful lot of money. And because of that, people who are maybe struggling for money are going into some villages and taking donkeys overnight. So some villages in Africa are waking up and finding all their donkeys gone, which has implications obviously for them to be able to generate income, but it's also starting to push the price of donkeys very high, which means that people that lose their donkeys can't afford to replace their donkeys. And it's impacting every country, so Pakistan won't be immune to that either. And in
fact, I think a few years ago, I think it was about 5 years ago, if and correct me if I'm wrong, but Pakistan was actually one of the highest exporters of donkey skins. I think it was in 2000 was it 17 or 7? I can't remember. But so I mean, it is an issue that directly affects Pakistan and the way that people economically and socially engage and interact with donkeys. So it is a very relevant issue.
Yeah, it has implications for biosecurity as well, because the way a lot of these skins are cured and transported, there are potential issues with things like anthrax, right, amongst others. So yeah, it's got human health implications as well as socioeconomic ones for the communities where they're losing their donkeys, so. And welfare ones as well, to be fair.
So I just want to be mindful of the time here. So I do see that we have a variety of other questions, but perhaps I'll limit it to one more just in the interest of time. What are some ways that we can encourage students to become more compassionate and sensitive to animals? Do you have some strategies for doing that? And an extension to that would be, if we're taking that one step further to the classroom and in an education system, are there different ways that we're able to assess or observe or track the progress of the development of children and how they exhibit their compassion?
Yeah, well, I think starting with the first one, I think strategies in classrooms. one of the most successful things in the UK recently has been using bird life, having bird feeders in trees around schools to bring birds in, getting the children engaged in watching the birds and bird behaviour, which they can do quite safely from distance. Things like insect hotels. These aren't, obviously we're not talking about sort of necessarily mammals here, but insect hotels are very popular in English schools now as well, and bug hunts. So there are a whole range of strategies. There are often in UK classrooms there are animals kept as pets within the classroom. There are some ethical issues around those things, but the RSPCA have one of our leading animal charities has produced a whole set of guidelines about animals in schools. So that's one way you can bring the animals in, or you can encourage wildlife around the school. Taking children out to sites is obviously the next thing on field trips and visits to areas is another way of engaging. So there are a range of strategies that you can come, you can sit down and plan within a curriculum, I think, across a year, where you're putting children into the proximity of animals and they're working closely with them or they're observing them. In terms of engaging of evaluating their emotional engagement. Well, I suppose the most straightforward thing is to ask them. I mean, some of the work that we've been doing with the Care Farm charities in the UK is talking to the children about what they think about the animals, across the year. I mean, the care farm visits take place. Children go down to the farms about they go down for a day, perhaps 2-3 times a term. They look after certain animals. And you can evaluate their attitudes to those animals before, during, and after the events. So any kind of evaluation of learning, can be developed. But what you tend to find is that when you're looking at compassion and emotional engagement, those research tools are always going to be qualitative rather than quantitative. It's not too easy to overly adopt a quantitative approach to a qualitative thing like emotional engagement. But there are already pre-published research papers that have got established methodologies for evaluating emotional engagement. So there is already a literature there.
And I think it speaks very highly to the really deep value that educators and teachers have on these kind of issues and in developing, encouraging the development of social skills and character development and pro-social citizenship with children, to be able to use those kind of strategies within the classrooms and tease out those kind of curiosities with children. So I think it's we're lucky that we have a group of people here who thankfully are up to that challenge and who've joined us on this journey with this program. So hopefully this will be the beginning of something in Pakistan where we can start to share these kind of ideas and these kind of teaching methods to encourage those kind of characteristics. Tamlin and Roger, I'd love to thank you both for joining us today for the webinar. You've shared a wealth of information, new to me, I'm sure new to a lot of people here. I'm very grateful to have you here. For anybody, any of our guest attendees or for the trainers, if you'd like to learn more about Tamlin and Roger's work or about the organization they work with, you can visit them at thedonkeysanctuary.org.uk. Similarly, unfortunately, Yasmin from the Global Schoolhouse Initiative was not able to join us, but if you would like to learn more about their organization, you can go to thusglobalschoolhouse.org. Again, for some of our guests joining us, please remember that we are partnering on this project with the Government of Sindh Education Foundation, and the master trainers that have joined us today are with that organization. So if you'd like to learn more about them, you can visit them at sef.org.pk. And finally, if you would like to learn more about Join Hands and the work that we do, you can visit us at joinhands.org. So our final webinar is finally approaching us, and that will be taking place on March 2nd. And we'll be joined by the very impressive Professor Terence Ryan from the University of Oxford, who will be talking about wellness with us and kindness. And we will also be joined by directors from the Sindh Education Foundation, by Shapara Rizvi, who is the Director of Programs and Training, the Director of Training and Assessment, I'm sorry, and by Sada Vanis, who is the Director of Programs. So we'll get a little bit of insight into the SEF program and Caring for Life in Pakistan. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. I hope you are all doing well, and I hope you have a good month ahead, and I hope we'll see you during the next webinar. Take care, everyone. Be well. See you next month.